So good afternoon and welcome to another CISO policy discussion hosted by the National Technology Security Coalition. The NTSC is a coalition of senior technology security executives, including over 40 chief information security officers from Fortune 1000 firms across the nation. Our mission is to bring the voice of the chief information security officer to Washington, D.C., ensuring that the practitioner's voice is being heard on Capitol Hill. Today, we are joined by Emilian Papadopoulos, the president of Good Harbor Security Risk Management and NTSC Advisory Council member, as well as an advisor to the NTSC Strategy Committee. I'm going to let Emilian introduce his guest today, but before I do, I just want to remind everyone that you can learn more about the NTSC by visiting www.ntsc.org. With that plug for the coalition completed, please allow me to turn the program over to Emilian with my thanks for agreeing to lead today's important conversation and for your continued support of the NTSC. Emilian, over to you.
Terrific, Patrick. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who is joining us today. It's great to be with you all. When President Biden issued his executive order on May 12th, hard to believe it was only just a few weeks ago. When he issued his executive order on May 12th, a number of things jumped out at me as interesting, but one in particular stood out, the Cyber Safety Review Board in Section 5 of the executive order. I'd heard about this idea, a cyber NTSB, was a little bit surprised to see it take effect in an executive order so quickly. I had questions, I'm sure you've got questions, and we're going to answer them today. I'm going to start off with a kind of fireside chat discussion with my guest, Adam Shostack, but we will be having a Q&A beginning midway through the session. And so I encourage you to think of your questions. You can post them in the Q&A as we go here, and then we'll save them up throughout the conversation and get to those again in the latter half. So please do post any questions that you've got. We'll make sure to get to them. My goals for this conversation are, first, just to make sure that we all understand what the executive order said about the Cyber Safety Review Board, the history and context of that idea, and what it means for all of, in particular, you CISOs in your own companies, and also what it means for the mission of the National Technology Security Coalition to bring the voice of the CISO to Washington, D.C. To help me with those objectives, I'm joined today by Adam Shostack. Adam, thank you so much for being here with us today. Adam is a leading expert on threat modeling. He is an entrepreneur and consultant. He both mentors startup companies and helps organizations with their own security. He's a technologist. He's an author, the author of Threat Modeling, Designing for Security, the co-author of The New School of Information Security. He's a member of the BlackHat Review Board. And I could go on, but Patrick told me I would run out of time if I read Adam's entire bio. So Adam is very well versed, both in the public and private perspective on a lot of these issues, the adversarial and the defender perspective. So Adam, it's great to have you here with us today. Thank you again for being here. You've been working around this idea for a long time. We won't necessarily hold you accountable for everything that the Biden administration put into the executive order, but you've got great context on it. Where did this idea come from? Big picture, and then more recently, how did it gain momentum and arrive in the executive order?
Sure. And thanks for having me. It's really great to be here with you and your community. This idea really comes from a sense of frustration with the state of the cybersecurity defenses that we have. Breaking news this morning, there's a memo from the National Security Advisor saying business executives should immediately convene their leadership teams to discuss the ransomware threat and review corporate security policies. And so for those of you who are with us live, expect to see some questions shortly about that. But also this provides some context. The idea of a cybersecurity review board has been around for 30 years. It shows up first in a National Academies report, Computers at Risk, in 1991. And then the idea has bounced around for a good while. And I think what we're seeing now is the administration saying, we've got to try some new and different things. rather than we're going to double down on what we've been doing, we're going to add some layers of innovation to policy. And I think that's why this showed up in a slightly different way, is because it's one of those things that people have been saying we should give this a shot for quite a while. And there are some real objections, and I think we're going to cover those objections that made people wary of it. But the context and the reason that it's happening now is because there's an increasing perception that what we're doing is not having the impact we'd like it to have in terms of defending ourselves.
Terrific. And I certainly think a lot of the CISOs on the line would agree that certainly what they're getting as well from the defensive perspective is not working for many of them. It used to be, that you would say there are two kinds of companies: those that have been hacked and know it, those that have been hacked and don't know it yet. Increasingly, we do believe that there is a third kind of company, the resilient company. It is possible to defend against most attacks, and certainly frequent and indiscriminate attacks, but it's very difficult, and it's for what is sometimes called the security 1% or the 10%. And most companies out there need a little bit more support. They need a little bit more innovation. They need a more coherent approach to be able to take to their security and safety. So hopefully this group will help innovate in that way, as you said. Let's level set for everybody. I'm going to take a guess that CISOs on the front line might not have spent as much time reading the executive order as you and I have had the opportunity to do. So what does the executive order actually say about the Cyber Safety Review Board?
So the order says that in a set of circumstances, Homeland Security will convene a Cyber Safety Review Board, which has 90 days to reflect on what has happened and issue a report. And the circumstances which trigger that are primarily a cyber event defined in a presidential directive, but really a major cyber event that requires a response at the cross-governmental level, or at the discretion of the president or the Secretary of Homeland Security. And that's going to be a really interesting question of how often that discretion is invoked and where it's invoked. And so this first one is focused on solar winds. That's the subject of the first investigation. And we'll be seeing a report from that in mid-August.
Terrific. So if I'm hearing right, there will be established a Cyber Safety Review Board. It'll exist, and either it may decide to go look at something that meets that triggering threshold, or the president or the Secretary of Homeland Security can say, I want you to go look at this thing.
Exactly.
Got it. And I noticed in there, I think there's a question about, is this board going to be running around investigating every little thing? And I note that, as you mentioned, the EO referenced an older presidential policy directive, PPD 41 from the Obama administration. And that PPD, to provide everyone the language, distinguished between cyber incidents, which were pretty much anything touching a computer, and a significant cyber incident, which it defined as an incident or a group of related incidents that are likely to result in demonstrable harm to the national security interests, foreign relations, or economy of the United States, or to the public confidence, civil liberties, or public health and safety of the American people. So we've already got baked in a threshold that this has to be of national significance. Is that right?
I think it is. And I think that the goal of the administration is to get smarter about what's happening, to get some authoritative information about what's happening. And I talk to CISOs all the time. Nobody wants to be investigated. Nobody wants to be deposed. I don't think that this is going to be funded or authorized to go and muck into most companies' business or most incidents. It's really a major incident response approach at the moment.
One of the objections that we've heard about, to your point, is the risk of mandatory reporting. Right now, companies must report, if they're publicly traded and there's a material incident, which largely they can define reasonably, or if there's a massive breach of PII, something like that. But there's a lot that can happen, and that does happen in networks every day, that companies don't have to disclose to the public or to the government if they're not supporting the government. Does the EO already create a mandatory reporting requirement, or do you think it will?
So the first thing about mandatory reporting is we have mandatory reporting under a lot of different regimes already. GDPR, for example, has very, very fast reporting requirements in place. This EO in Section 2F establishes new reporting requirements for federal contractors. And I think, again, the context to think about this is that policymakers are dissatisfied with what's happening. And I think in my conversations with you and my conversation with Patrick, there's really an opportunity to engage in some thought leadership around this and say, why are we seeing these demands for more and more reporting? And how can we make these either less burdensome to get the same result or more useful for the same amount of work? And I think there's some opportunities there. And one that I've been investigating with Steve Bellavin at Columbia and Blake Reed at the University of Colorado is near miss reporting. And this also builds on an aviation safety model where there's an incentive to report a near miss. And it's voluntary. And NASA does a whole bunch of science with that. You report to NASA, they're a science agency, not a regulator. And I think that there's some real possibilities to meet the goals of these reporting regimes in a way where you say, ooh, that was a weird one, or that was close. And let's learn from that. And I'd love to talk more about that, but in the interest of staying strategic at the start of this, I'm going to stop there.
It's definitely an interesting idea, and I do want to come back to the concept of near miss reporting. And I can imagine, I know a lot of CISOs that I talk to would say, I don't want to have to report anything more than what I already have to report, and I really don't want to have to report things that didn't actually happen or didn't actually have consequence. So why would I want to do that? So we'll come back to that later and see if maybe you can persuade us that that's a good idea, or in the interests of CISOs. Staying on what is in the EO right now about the CSRB, I think what I heard you say is it doesn't create any new mandatory reporting that isn't already out there. Is that right? So far.
I think it does create new federal contractor reporting requirements, but this is not my area of expertise, but Section 2F seems relevant to that question.
Right, just for federal contractors, and then for federal government agencies, of course, they're going to be part of the scope of the CSRB as well.
I don't think it's new requirements for federal agencies, just the contractors.
Just not new reporting requirements, but the CSRB might look at an incident that has affected.
Yes.
Yeah, great. What is one of the interesting topics for us at NTSC always is, where is the private sector's voice in this, right? Because it's often missing. What does the EO say about where the private sector should be involved in this board?
So this is really interesting. It explicitly discusses private sector participation at the invitation of the Secretary of Homeland Security. And we've been doing a workshop on this concept funded by NSF over the last little while, and we heard from a chair of the NTSB at that workshop. A lot of the way the NTSB, the real NTSB, works to investigate aviation incidents is to draw on staff provided by industry. So if there's an incident, pilots will show up both from the impacted airline and from a pilots union. And I think that to the extent that the CSRB is following the NTSB model, sorry for all the acronyms, there's a real opportunity for industry to provide staffing, and in providing staffing, have an opportunity to help direct what we're learning, help provide expertise so that they're not being judged unfairly, and get that voice in the room in Washington, D.C. And so I think participation is a really useful opportunity in the way the EO is structured.
Yeah, it's good. It's good to see, in the initial output there, that they're, considering the perspective of the private sector. I think also the board would have, is it a chair and a deputy chair, that one would be from the private sector? Is that right?
The language is slightly unclear, but I think that's the way I read it.
Yeah, it seems like the secretary appoints a chair and a second chair, and one of them has to come from the private sector. It being a government created organization, you'd imagine the chair might generally be, repetitively the public sector person. It doesn't indicate that they have to go back and forth. But it was interesting to me that right there, near the top of the organization, it suggests a private sector role. I agree with you that it's still a little unclear. Maybe it was written a little bit quickly as Colonial Pipeline was starting to happen, and they really wanted to get it off to the presses. But that's good to see about the private sector. The other thing I noticed, multiple times the EO references the private sector, and one time they talk about cybersecurity, vendors or providers or something like that. And I thought it was interesting that it intentionally or not specifically highlighted the vendors, but didn't specifically highlight the defenders, the chief information security officers.
One of the things that you hear from every CISO is, I'm one problem away from being fired. And I think that there's a positive in what you just pointed out, which is that there's some recognition that a lot of these problems may relate to the technology in use rather than how it's being used.
Right. Yeah. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. All of us assemble the systems that serve our business, that deliver value to our customers out of a set of components that other people have created. And when we do that, how to say this? I think one of the things that the board recognizes is that decisions made by the people supplying you have dramatic impact on your ability to secure them. And I worked for Microsoft for most of a decade. I spent time, I think, with some of you while I was working with Microsoft's CISO advisory board. And there's back and forth over how should these things be designed? What features should a company like Microsoft put in? And again, to go to the NTSB model for the purposes of analogy, you'll see the NTSB making recommendations to Airbus and Boeing, as well as to the airlines and the pilots. And I think that that is one of the potentially very transformative impacts that this may have, is it may take some attention from the end users of technology towards the technology vendors, and also towards the practices that we use in assembling things. How should we do that? What are the effective techniques? And do the systems that we're buying have compatible screws and clamping points and all the other stuff that we need to really pull them together into assemblages that we can actually understand where our assets are, protect them, detect problems. And if one system has metric screws and another has US style screws, then you end up buying fasteners to interconnect. And that's relevant to the way these incidents go down. And I think it's not well understood at the policy level. And so I'm hopeful that this CSRB can take some of those bits and bytes and in the weeds sort of things and bring them up to an understandable level where we can have better conversations about them.
Yeah, that's terrific. And that dovetails well with the other parts of the executive order about software bill of materials as an example. And of course, bearing in mind that this all at least was catalyzed by SolarWinds in December leading into this. So that makes sense. The last thing I just want to highlight that I thought was really interesting from the text of the executive order is, as you mentioned, the board, stands up quickly. It has 90 days to review this first thing, SolarWinds, just like it will have time to review other ones in future. And then there's a bit, section I, that says, after you're done your first review in 90 days, within 30 days, the Secretary of Homeland Security needs to provide back to the President and National Security Advisor a review and recommendations about the board. And it's quite expansive. I'm not going to read all of it, but options for the board's composition or authorities, the board's proposed mission, scope, and responsibilities, membership eligibility, board governance, thresholds and criteria for the types of cyber incidents to be evaluated, sources of information available to the board, and an approach for protecting information provided to the board, because many people are worried about the ability of government organizations to hold on to information securely. So all of those things that I just listed are within 120 days after May 12 is when the secretary is going to be reporting back to the president saying, here's what I think all of this should look like. So although the EO establishes some things, sets some things in stone or in wet cement at least, there's a whole lot that is open here and subject to change, particularly in about 115 days.
I think one of the interesting things, as you said, it's a very expansive list, but let me point out what's not on it, which is the continued existence of the board. And so I think there's an opportunity to ask ourselves, what would we like to see this board doing? What value propositions might it offer? Many of you might have seen there was an article in Wired, a 10-year retrospective of the RSA hack. Maybe we could get history or authoritative stories, and that's not going to change the outcome of the initial lawsuits that are happening, but maybe it will change. I heard from someone that there were new motions filed in the target lawsuits this month, that they're still going on 8 years later. And maybe having some authoritative reporting will help us say these things are reasonable, these things less so, right? There's never an unalloyed positive in a lawsuit except its dismissal or completion. But we can think about the value that we get from reporting. We can think about what we would like, because yes, a lot of things up in the air, except the continued existence of the board.
Right, absolutely. So let's make that wish list. So imagining what you would like this board, we know it's going to continue. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like. We know that it's going to need, staffing and authorization and funding, which, might hamper its remit and scope a little bit if it doesn't get as many people and as much funding as it wants. Although it can of course partner with the private sector. But let's talk about the wish list, and maybe let's start by coming back to near miss reporting, which I know is near and dear to your heart. So with regard to near miss reporting, if I'm a CISO, the idea that I would need to go out and report voluntarily or by mandate stuff that didn't even cause a consequence, just came close to causing a consequence. That doesn't sound terribly attractive to me. So, why is this a good thing? And then how could it be designed that it would maybe assuage concerns for CISOs and frankly for CEOs?
So the advantage to near misses and the advantage to voluntary are some control worked. You dodged the bullet, and that reduces a set of negative consequences of talking about what happened. right? You're not going to get sued because nothing was taken. You're not going to end up on the front page of the newspaper because your pipeline, your meat processing plants didn't shut down. And in saying that some control worked, we have a crucial opportunity to learn what's working so that each of you can say, huh, that control worked for my peer. Do I have that control in place? The other part of that statement, some control didn't work. That's why it's a near miss. Allows us to say, am I over investing in this control? It allows us over time to say, do we really need this control on the list of things that I have to do to comply with CSF and PCI and NYDFS, right? There's a number of things in each of those regulations that, frankly, I don't think are worth your time or budget. How do we get them out? How do we make that argument? I believe that near misreporting and incident reporting, incident investigation can help us get there. And so, yes, there's an immediate burden and a long-term payoff that's tremendously important.
That sounds extremely attractive. The idea that we could actually have a knowledgeable, non-regulatory board and not a knee-jerk board that is coming in and reviewing not just one, but near misses across many organizations, and is saying, you know, we're hearing that CISOs are spending a lot of time and money on these controls, and we don't really see them adding a whole heck of a lot of value. So maybe we can get rid of those or make them voluntary or allow people in regulation to explain away why they shouldn't exist. That sounds extremely attractive.
So if I can just jump in for a second on the immediate versus the long-term and the thought leadership. The framing of this board is major incidents, right? You talked about the PPD 41 bar that's there. So I don't know that this board by itself will end up being that thing, being a near miss repository or analysis point. But I do think in terms of what is the policy goals of the organization here, being able to say, let's put a higher bar for the board to investigate the private sector. And then let's make a trade where we bring up near misreporting to meet some of the goals that the policymakers have. We might be able to help shape the future of the board, the lesson learning systems we have in our sector, and meet the public policy goals that are increasingly, we need more, we need different, and we need more effectiveness now.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned an interesting word that I want to pick up on there. You mentioned sectors. And I think all the CISOs on the line, know that what works in one sector may be different in another sector. Does the EO and the initial description of the review board say anything about how that organization will partner with sector-specific agencies or get that kind of expertise to be able to, when they're going in to look at something in agriculture versus looking at something in aviation, to know what those different environments look like?
I don't think it's as clear as our audience today would like. And here again, I think that being the voice of the CISO, engaging soon to say, we can get you representatives, we can send staff to help the board understand these things at a sector by sector level is going to be really helpful, because you're right. Retail is different than critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructures differ between food processing and chemical processing. And so accepting that the board is going to exist and asking how can we constructively help it meet its goals, I think is the biggest opportunity and the place where we need to move quickly.
Yeah, absolutely, and I agree with you, particularly on that last point about moving quickly, because there is that, May 12 plus 120 days. That's when Secretary of Homeland Security is reporting back. So you kind of backwards map from there how long it's going to take to, crystallize key objectives like the ones you just outlined, get them in front of the right people, and then make that case. There will be opportunities for influence later, but that's the really big window of opportunity right now. Let me ask one more question on near miss, and I will, in about 5 minutes, we'll turn to some audience questions that we're getting. So I do encourage everybody to continue posting in the chat, and I welcome those questions. Near miss reporting, in the aviation example that you gave, that doesn't go to the FAA, it goes to NASA. It gets, I imagine, anonymized to a degree, and then science is done. It is analyzed, and the results are distributed back. In cybersecurity, we always deal with the challenge that we've got adversaries, and we want to be careful about how and when we share with adversaries what we think isn't working and what controls we're going to ramp up or tamp down. There was this recent case of, I think it might have been Bitdefender, that published an error in the dark side malware, at which point dark side said, thank you very much, we fixed it. We are no longer using the same keys in all of our ransomware, so you can't just pass a key around in the background and decrypt. Thanks for bringing that to our attention. And ever since, dark side ransomware has been much more debilitating for organizations. So we have to be careful about that. How do you think about whether this group would keep some versus other information confidential, anonymize information? What should that look like?
Well, it's a big question, and anonymizing the information is tremendously important. And one of the things that I see all the time, I help organizations threat model. I help them bring an understanding of problems at an abstracted level into their engineering. And if we move from malware group to malware group and stop thinking about things at the level of dark side versus this or that, and start thinking about things at the level of, all of this ransomware is accessing files, and it's doing so at a much higher rate than almost any other non-operating system process ever does. That level of analysis, or saying, accepting a 5% phishing click-through rate, which is about what you can get to through the best training out there, means that you need better models of system isolation, and whatever vendor it is you're using, we need to step those things up. We need to take more of these technical defenses. That level of things doesn't inform attackers in a meaningful way, but it can inform our defenses. And look, everyone who's a CISO, we were talking in our prep meeting about you not letting salespeople in here. Everyone here is overwhelmed by salespeople who have a solution to all your problems. Which of these things really actually make a difference against the ways in which the attackers are getting in? Because I'll be honest, I don't see the ways that attackers are getting in changing very quickly. It's a lot of stuff attached to messaging, and messaging is changing a little bit. It's more than just email. But if we model our threats, if we abstract a little bit and start thinking about the fundamental, hard to change pieces of the attack chains, we can get much better at defenses in a way that I think is actually essential to moving away from the one problem and it's over sort of defenses that a lot of folks have found themselves with.
Right, absolutely right. We have, I'm going to go to our first kind of question. I'll start weaving in questions from our audience. Zachary Jetson asked, are there any direct impacts to organizations from this EO besides reporting requirements? And what do organizations need to do to prepare? And some of that might not have an answer yet. The board has to, formalize a little bit more, but what is your answer to what do organizations, how else does this affect organizations? And if you're a CISO out there, today, what should you be doing to prepare your organization for what you think will come downstream?
So my reading of the executive order has been primarily focused on the reporting board because it's a longstanding interest of mine. A lot of the impacts are focused on government agencies and government contractors. And there is a piece which is called SBOM, Software Bill of Materials. And if you are a producer of software, you need to get on creating and delivering these bills of materials to your customers. This also represents an opportunity for those of you who don't produce software. So this is not something you need to do to prepare, but an impact is you can start collecting these bills of materials and start using them to inform your asset inventories. You can start integrating them into your vulnerability management programs, into your patch management programs. And so that is an opportunity. And, fortunately, for many of you, it's an opportunity that you can take on your own schedule rather than being forced to, as Zachary is asking, what do I need to do to prepare? It is different if you're a federal contractor. There's a number of things in there, but for many, the SBOM will be a positive change that happens over the next year.
Right, terrific. And I'm hearing the theme that you're highlighting again is the answer, there are mandates for federal agencies in terms of some protections that they have to do. There are federal contractors, and then there are software manufacturers, and there's everybody else, are kind of the four, pieces of scope in the EO for different parts of the EO. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, terrific. And one other piece that I noticed was, there were some more prescriptive directions for federal agencies and things that they need to do to protect themselves. That doesn't directly impact a company, but heavy emphasis on endpoint monitoring, heavy emphasis on zero trust, heavy emphasis on multi-factor authentication. And I think they even threw zero trust in there, in addition to SBOM. The one other piece was a requirement for federal agencies to work at getting faster at identifying vulnerabilities, patching and fixing vulnerabilities, and also to improve their incident response playbooks. And so I could imagine that, this is not an explicit requirement that is in there, but if you're a federal contractor or a provider to the government in any way, you might want to be attuned to the fact that your customer is working on getting faster and tighter at these things and thinking about their third party as part of that. So that could eventually come downstream from individual agency requirements or from CISA eventually.
Yeah, and I think one of the things to pop up a level of, there are those things that you enumerated just now. The White House letter that I mentioned at the start has a different list of 5. The cybersecurity framework is again different. And I think one of the things that makes our lives as defenders so difficult is that every week we get a different set of these things. And my hope is that one of the things that the board will emphasize is the overwhelming burden of dealing with these, pick your framework sorts of problems just makes your lives harder than it needs to be.
Right. I think everyone on the line can relate to that. Absolutely. We have a question from Chris Cavino, who said the following. The Cyber Solarium Commission recommended the creation of a Bureau of Cyber Statistics. If one was created, how do you see it complementing or working with the Cyber Review Board?
So it's a great question. And the way I tend to think about this is there's at any given resourcing level, You can either go broadly or you can go deeply, and they serve different purposes. So there's a lot of focus today on fast collection of indicators, IOCs, TTPs, getting those out to enable defenders to move and find things. The board, I think, is going to go deeply on a small number of incidents. So it will be at a different point in that space. And I think the Bureau will have the function of assessing how many of these things are really happening, right? How many ransomware incidents were there last year? I have no idea. It's easy when we look at the headlines to believe that the sky is falling, that we're not going to have a burger on Memorial Day. And is it really worse than it was last year? By how much? If Tony Blinken goes to Russia and twists their arm to start cracking down on ransomware gangs, what is the impact of that? That is the sort of thing that a Bureau of Cyber Statistics can give us an answer to. And unfortunately for you all, it means more forms, more reporting, and hopefully we can get to a point where those forms are lightweight. They're protected information, so we're not going to be in the headlines because we file it. And they're aligned between DFS, GDPR, CCPA, all of these programs. And it would be my hope that a Bureau of Cyber Statistics could provide some leadership where we see alignment in these forms. Maybe we even see an opportunity to post a single form to the Bureau and they agree to send it on to the places that need to see it. And so going back to the very first thing I said here, policymakers are not happy with the state of the world, and they're going to be engaged in a set of innovations, a set of experiments, and our opportunity as practitioners is to engage with their goal, help them understand the costs that are associated with it, make sure we understand where they're going with them, and to find ways to meet those goals that meet our goals. Right? How do we become more effective defenders? How do we become more effective at engineering effective security into the systems that are running our business? And how can these things either hinder or help us? And how do we get there quickly?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, a great call to action. And you're right that policymakers are they feel the spotlight, they're frustrated, and they're beginning to understand better than they used to some of what's going on here. Everybody on this call has known for a long time that this was a big issue, and people on this call have been working for 20 years in the interest of cybersecurity. A lot of policymakers are coming to it now, and they're coming to it because there were lines at gas stations. The sanctity of the American hamburger was, briefly put at risk. JBS actually, I think, responded very well and was back up and running quickly. And riders of the MTA are, hearing today that their transit agency was also, hacked, although no direct impact on them so far. So it's becoming real. And my fear is knee-jerk reaction and regulation, right? So Colonial Pipeline, and all of a sudden TSA says, we're going to use the authority over pipelines that by the way, we've had all along, but we're going to use it now. And we're going to go do something, and it's mandatory reporting, and it wasn't terribly constructive. I don't think that there was anything, I'm not saying it was bad to do it, but there was not a lot yet that we've heard from TSA that would actually help a CISO in that industry, do their job better, or know what's going on about, what's coming in threats. So the idea that we could try to move away from any knee-jerk reactions, particularly in Congress, and towards innovation, experimentation based on research and science and data, and ideally from a cyber safety review board that is working with the private sector, that is working with sector-specific agencies, so they can distinguish agriculture and retail, so they can distinguish IT and OT. That would be very good. Let me go quickly to a quick lightning round. I have 2 other questions for you, and then we'll invite Patrick to come back and help us wrap up the session here. One question is, we didn't talk about the crown jewel that any company wants, liability protection. So the U.S. Chamber of Commerce wants lawmakers to include liability protections in any type of breach disclosure and working with the government, so on. Is that realistic here when you think about everything that's out there in terms of state regulations and the state of play of international and national regulation? I mean, should we be thinking about liability protection here at all?
So just going to be very frank, conversation with a very, very senior policymaker who said, so Deepwater Horizon is going to get liability protection for what they did to the Gulf. There's a lot of senior level skepticism about liability protection. And one of the things that brought me to near misses is that near miss reporting actually gives a thumb on the scale with regulators, which is that it is counted as what the lawyers call evidence of constructive engagement. I think we can get that. I think that when I speak with general counsels at Fortune 100 companies, they're like, yes, that matters to me. I would like the regulator to be forced to say that we constructively engaged. And so near miss reporting, I think that sort of, let's find models that work. Let's find where liability protection is working in other areas. But I think that broad general requests for liability protection are going to fall on stone ears.
Great perspective. Thank you. And we will remember that you are not the one making the decision. You are informing us of what you're hearing out there and what you think the political climate is.
Thank you.
My last question, you talked about IOCs and threat intelligence and so on. When I think that, we're always trying to do better information sharing. It's the thing that everyone kind of can agree we should do generally, and then the details are really, really hard. I wonder if the Cyber Safety Review Board, if it were looking at an incident or a campaign, do you think it might have the remit, and do you think it'd be helpful for it to identify better ways to do threat sharing or information sharing across organizations? Because in the case of something like SolarWinds, I don't think that it's limited to just going to talk to the company SolarWinds. It can take that incident and it can go, do a review broadly. And so it might find, actually, like post 9/11 Commission, we had all the dots, we just hadn't connected them, and here are better ways to connect them. Is that possible?
I think it is. I think it's a great point. The fact of SolarWinds, we know about it accidentally. We know about it because of Mandiant. Having followed up on an incident and dug into it, actually followed up on a near miss inside of Mandiant, and then wrote a blog post that exploded this whole thing. What happened with the wide variety of detection technologies, I think, is in scope. There have been blog posts from other companies saying, oh yeah, we had indicators of this and we put them into our tooling, but we didn't make a big deal out of them. How much did that happen? How much were indicators discovered privately and then not shared? There's an incident that I was involved in where the company decided not to share any of their indicators so that they could detect the attackers when they came back in. I'm not bringing it up to criticize. I want to be clear. That's an approach that we should talk about, because when you say everyone agrees sharing is good, you're right. And there are actually countervailing interests that do play in that we have a hard time talking about. And so I think that having that objective perspective, that in-depth thinking, and saying, what could we do about that? Is there, a technological trick we could do, homomorphic encryption, for example, that would let us share indicators without showing what they are? Would that be enough for all of you to start sharing more indicators out of your incidents? And so I think there's a lot that we can learn if, and again, I'm hammering on this point for a very specific reason, constructive engagement at this point is so tremendously important. And so I'm looking forward, hoping to work with you more on this, and hoping that all of you on this call will see that if we engage, we can change our jobs, not tomorrow, not next week, but next year, make our own lives a lot better with an investment right now.
Absolutely. Thank you, Adam, for joining us for that terrific call to action. I think you've got the batting order right. This afternoon, it's answer CEO questions about ransomware after every CEO got the Biden memo. Tomorrow is advocate on this issue, and a little bit down the road, we benefit from it long term. For anyone who wants to dive into some of Adam's writings, musings, books, and so on, adam.shostack, SHOSTACK.org is his personal website. I encourage you to go check it out. And Adam, let me thank you again. Really, really appreciate the conversation. You've pulled back the curtain on the history of the EO, what it says about the Cyber Safety Review Board. And I think most importantly, what is the opportunity that we all have right now to actually influence it in a way that it's going to work best for CISOs and for protecting critical infrastructure, because boy, do we need it. So thank you again. Patrick, let me turn it back to you to bring us home.
And thank both of you. That such an important conversation. In the almost 6 years that I've been working in this role as the executive director of the NTSC, I've come to the realization that you're never going to please everybody. I think what we need to dwell on are the positive aspects of the executive order and how we can leverage them to better protect the nation. And certainly the NTSC, Adam, will be on the Hill talking to our congressional leaders, because ultimately the EO is a guide for the Congress and what they need to do next. And so we want to make sure that the voice of the practitioner is getting to the Hill, and so they can hear from the CISOs. So with that, thank you very much. We will post this webinar on our website in the next couple of days. You can reference it, and we'll post it on LinkedIn once it's up, Adam. So thank you very much. Everybody have a wonderful afternoon, and look forward to June 15th, Emilian, and your conversation with Nicole Perloff. Have a great day.